So in this chapter, we are going to look at the business cycle. So first of all, I'm going to show you the data. From data, you're going to see the US economy is going to fluctuate over time. It's very choppy. And I also want to emphasize this is not an American phenomenon. This happens pretty much everywhere else. Right? So based on the data, we are going to state the key regularity in GDP fluctuation, like to see the patterns. Hopefully, we can see some patterns. And then, so we are going to explain the importance of cold movement among economic time series. Right. So here there are two things. Number one, what is cold movement? And secondly, so we understand what does time series means. After that, I'm going to state the key properties of cold movements among components of GDP. Namely, so we're going to look at C and I, consumption and investment. Remember, if you look at demand of GDP, so first of all, maybe Y, or it's just right here, Y equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Because this is usually a small term, and this is kind of the government's policy. Right? So, and then hence we're going to focus on C and I. Right? So how this is going to move with Y? What are the patterns? And furthermore, we're going to discuss why cold movement between the price level and the real GDP, and between the inflation rate and the real GDP are important to understand the business cycle. Right? So here's the price level. So we're going to look at GDP deflator. Next, we're going to see the key cold movement among labor market variables and the real GDP. Right? So here we are going to largely talk about unemployment rate. Right, to understand the importance of labor market, and probably also look at labor productivity. And then, so we are going to also look at seasonal adjustment. Okay, we understand what that means and why we do seasonal adjustment. Finally, we are going to summarize this chapter by stating the key business cycle facts, right, regarding to the cold movement and regarding to the volatility. Okay, so this is this chapter. Now let's first look at some definitions, like business cycle definitions. Recession refers to a period of declining GDP. Okay, this is related to trend. Like for example, so what was your GDP during the past couple of years, right? So are you declining or rising? If it's declining, we call it recession. If it is increasing, and then we call it boom. Right? And then so we have peak. What's peak? This is the end of boom. Meaning, so you start to lose your momentum. Right? And then, so that's also indicates the beginning of recession. Now you have a trough, means everything must end. Right? You are going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So this is the end of recession, beginning of boom. That is a peak and a trough. It's like a turning point. Usually, there's no regular amplitude or frequency or of fluctuation, so we cannot see. That's going to show up in the next slide. But there's some regularities or business cycle facts. So this includes correlation. Okay, so usually it's correlation between C and a Y, correlation between I and a Y, as we're going to see. And then we also have relative variability, means the volatility of C versus Y, usually we should probably use sigma, refers to their volatility. And then so you have volatility of I versus Y, so on and so forth. Right? So this is something we're going to see some pattern. And finally, there's a phase. Right? So there's some variables could lead the business cycle, or could lag the business cycle, or it could be coincidence. Right? So again, so I'm going to explain these one by one to you and give you examples. All right, to summarize, so those are business cycle definitions and irregularities. We are going to dive into the data to see them one by one. Before I show you the data to highlight, usually it is very difficult to understand or predict or even to measure business cycle. right? The US economy is more volatile before World War II. And then after World War II, it becomes moderate. And this is especially true after 1985. And economists even coined a term called great moderation. Moderation means so the volatility becomes smaller or the economy becomes less volatile. Right. So this is after 1984. To show you the difficulty or relevance of this business cycle. NBER, this stands for National Bureau of Economic Research. So this is an institute that is responsible to determine whether the US economy is in a recession or not. On July 19th, 2021, they determined, based on their examination of US data, they determined the US economy enters a recession in February 2020 and ended in April 2020. Now look at the timing. When they announced, the recession already passed more than a year. Right? So why this is so difficult? Because to measure our aggregate economy usually take time and take effort. The other way to highlight the importance of business cycle is that it matters to stabilization policy. What is stabilization policy? You are trying to mitigate fluctuation of our economy. And why we care about this fluctuation? Because if the economy is in a recession, usually means the income is going to drop, unemployment rate is going to rise, people is going to lose their job. It's going to cause tremendous pain to the economy. Right? You want to stabilize the economy, meaning you are going to want to mitigate the fluctuation. Right? But in order to take the proper policy actions, and then first we need to understand where we are in terms of business cycle, so that we can decide, should the Fed act to cut the interest rate? Should the government respond by cut tax rate? Or should the government increase spending? Right? But everything relies on our understanding of business cycle. So that's the main topic of this chapter. Now let's look at idealized business cycle, or like a very stylized graph to show you what the business cycle looks like. So this is just some time series. So by the way, what's time series? We just track a variable throughout time. Like here we track real GDP throughout time. Right. First of all, you're going to see this fluctuate. Right? Always fluctuate. Now regarding to fluctuation, so we are going to identify different phase. Like here, like in this part, you can see it's rising, it's like growing. Right? It's growing. And the particular graph here, so above trend, so this is called a boom. And this is below trend, right? So particularly this part is below trend. This is recession. Now, regarding to expansion, at some point you reach the peak, and then you start to enter the new phase, like start recession. And regarding to recession, you reach the bottom, and then so you reach the trough, and then you start to recover. Right? And finally, so we call this difference, like this is like a magnitude of the business cycle, this amplitude, right? So this is just like how deep is the recession and how strong is the expansion. We call this amplitude. But this is an idealized business cycle. Right. First, let's look at some regularity, or like summarized facts or stylized facts, and then I'm going to show you the graph. I mean the real data. The fluctuation in GDP about trend are quite choppy. There's no regularity in the amplitude of fluctuation, and there's no regularity in the frequency of fluctuation. And based on these slides, you may feel, oh, this is hopeless to understand business cycle. But wait a second. So yes, we don't have any idea how big the fluctuation can be and how frequent the fluctuation can be. But later on, I'm going to show you some co-movement and some leading factor or lagging factor. So that is going to give us some clue where we are or which direction we are going. Okay. So this is how the economy looks like. On the horizontal line is the year. On the vertical line, this is a percentage deviation from the trend. What this means, let's just go back. So essentially, so this difference, that's the percentage deviation from the trend. So you may wonder what is trend? The trend, you can simple way you can think about, you just run a regression about our economy. And then, so this regression is going to generate long-term trend of the aggregate economy, right? So and any difference between the trend and the actual GDP, that is the deviation. And then so you may want to divide by the trend, or in other words, let's just use YT bar as a trend. And the YT is actual GDP. Okay, subtract, that's the difference. And then divided by YT bar. So that's give you the percentage deviation, right? So now if we plot this percentage fluctuation, you can see sometimes it's above trend, sometimes below, right? Let's just focus on the few things here, like here. So we have 74, 75, 81, 82, 1991, 2001, 2008. What are those? So those are essentially recessions, right? And then, so from here, what else we see? So recession essentially is a decline. It's a decline in GDP, or so you're deviate from trend below. And usually after the recession, there's expansion, and then so you're rising or you're expanding. This you are growing above the trend, right? As I just mentioned in the previous slides, let's go back here. So the fluctuation are quite choppy. This is like up and down, up and down. This is quite choppy. Now, we also say in the previous slides, in terms of the amplitude or the magnitude, it's very difficult. Sometimes, like this one, it's very mild, less than 2% drop. Sometimes it can be big, like here, it's almost 5%. No regularity. And another things we highlight is that, so you don't have much clue regarding the frequency, like how often the recessions come. Sometimes fairly close, sometimes it takes a while, right? No clue. Now let's see so whether we can find some other patterns by looking back, take a closer examination of the data. Okay. Oh, by the way, so this is the overall overview of the US business cycle. The data dates back to 1899. So actually, so this is first, right? It's the first phase of business cycle. Okay, here is the contraction, peak to trough, and expansion, right? And so on and so forth until the recent one, December 2007, right? So they just document all the recession we have experienced, right? So in the sense, there isn't much patterns, right? Because timing can be different, or maybe just look at here. The timing can be different, right? It can be very different. Okay. All right. So now let's just take a closer look. Before we show you the data, let's just look at a possible relationship between two variables, X or Y. Right? So for example, so you may be interesting to see how consumption is related with real GDP, how investment is related with real GDP, so on and so forth, right? And hopefully from there, we can see some patterns, or we can we can offer the right policy recommendation. So regarding to two time series, X and Y, okay, usually they have two possible relationships, and maybe three. So this is just, these are two you can see, but certainly they can be totally independent, meaning so there's no correlation between them. Here we just talk about if they are correlated, if they are related, what are the possible relationship you're going to see? First is that X and Y, they are positively correlated. What this means? Means if Y falls, look at here, this is Y, if Y falls or declines, X follow suit. If Y increase, X is going to increase as well. So they move in the same direction, more or less. They are tracking with each other. On the other hand, they can be negatively correlated. So when Y increase, X is going to fall. When Y falls, X is going to increase, meaning they are going to move in the opposite direction. Okay, certainly, it could be the case. There are third scenario. So they are totally independent, or there's no relationship. Right? So this is a relationship between two time series, X and Y. The other way to look at the relationship between two variables is that to see their leading or lagging. What this means? Here we have an example. X is a leading variable. So here GDP, this is one variable. Now X, if you look at X and GDP, so when X fall, usually it's going to help us to predict the direction of GDP. Right? To be precise here, if you observe X falling, and usually it comes with a decline in GDP just in a few quarters. So this means X is going to be helpful to predict the direction of GDP, and X is a leading variable. It's going to give you some clue. It's like a lead you to the next step. It's a leading variable. Now, if you look at a Y, again, so see the correlation with GDP. Y is behind GDP. Okay, instead of the direction Y give you some clue regarding the GDP. Now, GDP is going to tell you which direction Y is going to move. When GDP falls, and Y is going to fall just in a few months or maybe a quarter. When GDP rise, and it must be the case, Y is going to rise as well in a short period of time, right? To summarize, so for two variables, right, either it's lead or it's a lagging variable. If it's a leading variable, meaning your movement, your change is going to provide some clue or offer some insight regarding to the other variable's direction to move. On the other hand, if you are lagging variable, and then you're going to rely on the variable in questions to tell you the direction. But certainly, the X and the Y can be totally independent. But here, so independent probably is not what we're interested in. So the third possibility is that so X, Y, they move simultaneously, meaning they are coincidence. Right. Now let's look at another way. So what do we have here? Let's go back. So here, so we have positive correlation, negative correlation, which is plot these two variables over time. But alternatively, we can just plot these two variables simultaneously, right? So this X and a Y. This is called like a scatter plot. This is not over time, just each dot is represent represent the observation of X and Y at a particular time period. Or in other words, so those dots are not ordered in terms of time. Like we just plot them to see how their relationships looks like. So this offers us a different way to look at the correlation. Now here, so you can see if X and Y, if they're positive correlated, so in some sense you can see, so there you can just feed this data with a upward slope line. On the other hand, if they are negatively correlated, and then you can feed them with a downward slope line, right? So X and Y. And finally, it could be the case, so they are not correlated. Yes, you can say, okay, so this is line, like horizontal line, but what this means, this means is X change, right? So it's going to have no impact on Y. Or in other words, for Y, so there are many possible X. There's no clear relationship. But here, let's look at the first one. If X increase, and then this tells us Y is going to increase. And here, if X increase, it's going to tell us that Y is going to decline, right? So this is another way to look at the correlation between two variables, X and Y. Right? Now, let's just look at the correlation with real GDP. Right? So if for any particular macro variable, say for example consumption, it is positively correlated with deviation from trend of real GDP. Okay, and then so usually we call this pro-cyclical. Right? To be precise, if real GDP is above trend, is growing, is above trend, is growing. And if one variable, say for example X, is also increasing, or like positively correlated with the real GDP, and then we say this is pro-cyclical, meaning so I'm going to move together with you along the business cycle. On the other hand, if I decline when you are rising, and then this is counter-cyclical, meaning so I'm going to move in a different direction over the business cycle. And finally, it could be the case, there's a macro variable that's neither pro-cyclical nor counter-cyclical, and we call it acyclical, meaning along the business cycle, there's no clear pattern. Okay, not growing with GDP, not declining with GDP, right? Now let's look at the data one by one. Let's start with import, right? So remember, so for the aggregate demand, we have C, we have I, we have NX, we have G. But NX has two terms. Y is export, Y is import, right? And here we look at import. The blue line is GDP, but this percentage deviation from trend, right? And then this solid black line is import. What do we notice here? Clearly, these two are moving in the same direction. When GDP falls, the import falls, right? When GDP rise, import rise. This is number one. Meaning import are pro-cyclical, positively correlated with GDP, real GDP, right? There are two. And furthermore, in terms of fluctuation, what we notice, so import fluctuate more than GDP, right? So this is also reasonable. So import in some sense is not the essential, or probably it's less essential than domestic can produce or the consumption. Hence, when the GDP decline, you may want to cut your import. When GDP rise, and then you may want to expand your import. Right. So this is the first, write down. Third one. So import fluctuate more compared to real GDP. Right. To summarize, number one is pro-cyclical. Number two, positively correlated. But these two are the same thing. Number three, fluctuate more. Oh, by the way, one more thing in regard to leading or lag. Right. And in this example, so these two modulates move or change simultaneously, meaning so they are coincident, right? So you cannot use import change to predict GDP change. Neither you can use GDP change to predict import change because they change more or less the same time. This is important. So we can look at this previous one by using scatter plot, right? So again, so each dot is represent. Let's go back. Each dot represent somewhere here, right? We just plot like a cross. We just take each cross sections of this time series and plot them in this diagram. Horizontal line percent deviation from trend for real GDP. Vertical line is change for import. Now from here, it's very clear there's a positive correlation, right? Now we look at the next one, housing start. Housing start. So essentially, it is how many house has been started to build. Right. Now again, so we can see these two are correlated. Oh, by the way, so the black line is housing start. The blue line is GDP. Clearly, they are positively correlated. Right. Now, regarding to the fluctuation, these two are pretty much similar. But interesting, when we are in the expansion, the housing start expand in a smaller scale. But when we in the recession, so you can see usually, so the housing start decline in a much larger magnitude. Now, the other things we notice is that housing start is a leading factor. Let's say, for example, look at here. Look at this one. So the housing market pick up before the GDP pick up, right? Now here, so you can see, so the housing market decline before GDP decline. The same things, right? So particularly the housing market decline before GDP decline. And how we understand that? Just imagine how much resource, how much commitment you need to build a house, because it just take a while, right? Just think about those developers. So they need to predict the direction of the economy. So they make sure when they build the house, so there's demand. Otherwise, they are going to lose money. They are going to incur some loss, right? So in that sense, so this explains why housing start is a leading factor. Because those people in the business, they need to predict the direction of the economy. And this house usually take a while to build, right? Now we are going to look at two key macro variables. Yes, we have looked at import. That's part of the component of GDP. But there's two more things. The other things more important, which is consumption and the investment. We're also going to look at nominal variables, price level and money supply. And finally, we're going to look at labor market. This includes employment, real wage, and average labor productivity. Let's start with consumption. So consumption is indicated by this black line, and the GDP in this blue line. First of all, these two pretty much move in the same direction. When GDP falls, consumption falls. When GDP rises, consumption rises. right? These two are almost perfectly correlated. So number one. Number two, so these two just move simultaneously, meaning, so this is not a leading or lagging indicator. This is number two. And number three, the fluctuation of consumption related to GDP is smaller. This actually reflects the consumption smoothing, as we can discuss in the future chapter, but it's pretty intuitive, right? So consumption, you can think about, so you want to eat or not. I mean, it's how much you eat, how much food you're going to take, right? Your income is going to fluctuate, but really, so you don't want to starving today and feasting tomorrow. And usually you want to have like almost equal size of meal, right? Let's just give an example to understand what does consumption smooth means. Yes, your income can fluctuate, but you don't want to change your food intake or meal size dramatically, right? So this is a consumption smoothing, right? To summarize, consumption is pro-cyclical, positively correlated with real GDP. And the consumption move simultaneously with GDP. And finally, consumption, the volatility is smaller compared to GDP. Now let's look at the second important component, which is real investment. Right. So this investment including, like say, the housing start as we discussed earlier, but it also includes other investment. Now, what are we seeing from this diagram? The blue line is GDP, the black line is investment. It is obvious, so this should move together, right? So when GDP increase and investment increase, when GDP falls and investment falls, so they are positively correlated. This is similar to consumption. But in terms of magnitude, the investment adjustment is much more volatile, right? So when GDP falls, so the investment falls more than 3 or 4 times compared to GDP. This is also intuitive, right? So the investment is different from consumption. The investment usually is based on your reading of the direction of the future economy, right? Hence, usually it's going to respond more volatile compared to GDP. And then finally, so investment in general move simultaneously with GDP, but clearly some component of investment is a leading factor, like we talked about earlier, housing start, right? All right, here, so this is a scatter plot of a deviation trend in the price and the real GDP. Okay, so now we are going to look at something slightly different. Right? What do we think here? On the horizontal line is a deviation from trend in real GDP. Vertical line is a deviation from trend in price level. There's like a mild negative relationship, or I mean, it's hard to say, right? So the relationship is not clear. If you look at this part, it looks like a negative. If you look at this way, it can be positive. But in general, so their relationship is pretty weak. Okay. Now let's look at the price level. Okay, it means look at a different way. It means sometimes move together and sometimes move in the opposite, like here. So just move in the opposite way, right? But this opposite way. Okay, but sometimes it's positive correlation. So their relationship is not very clear. Now we are going to look at the labor market. So this is employment. Okay. Again, horizontal line is GDP, horizontal line is year, and the vertical line is the percentage deviation from trend. The blue line always refers to GDP, and the solid black line is employment. I actually see here, you can just refer to, I mean, the other way to think about it is unemployment, but probably it's going to inverse. Okay. So clearly from here, what do we see? The employment and the GDP, they move in the same direction. They are positively correlated, right? And the employment is not a leading or lagging factor. Or in other words, they move simultaneously. And finally, in terms of fluctuation, so employment fluctuate less compared to GDP. This is like a consumption. Right? So now we are going to look at productivity. Okay. So productivity, which is measured by the output per worker. Okay. So now productivity is the black line and the GDP is the blue line. Again, so what are we seeing? This is pretty much like employment. Okay. Productivity rise when GDP rise. Productivity falls when GDP falls. And finally, so productivity, the fluctuation is smaller compared to real GDP. Right? Or one more thing. So productivity is like employment. It's moves simultaneously with change in GDP, meaning it's not a leading factor, nor a lagging factor. Right? So now we have to look at each of the components of the GDP and also look at very important macroeconomic variable to see how they how they are correlated with real GDP, right? And see their fluctuation in terms of magnitude, right? And also just to examine whether they are leading factor or lagging factor, right? For most of them, they are not leading nor lagging, except housing start, which is a leading factor, right? Most of them are positively correlated with real GDP, right? And most of them fluctuate less, except investment, right? Okay, so now we are going to look at seasonally adjusted. What this means? First, let me show you the graph and then explain to you what that means. In this blue line, this is the original data, unadjusted. But this black line is the seasonally adjusted. And first of all, you can see the black line is smoother, or fluctuate less compared with the blue line. What's the difference? The difference is, now let me say, for example, if you just take a closer examination. Okay, by the way, this is unemployment rate. Let's take a closer examination, right? So if you look at any year, if we can zoom in, if we look at it every year, okay, or any particular time throughout the year. So how the season change matters to unemployment. And it's clearly, so in the winter, the unemployment, it may rise. Why? Because maybe there are less job opportunity. Just think about in a farm. Do you need a farmer to work for you? No, right? In the warm weather, in the summer, usually there are more jobs. Just think about in the cornfield. So now you need the people to work in the cornfield. Just think, this is one example in terms of agriculture. So meaning, so the unemployment or the employment may fluctuate with seasonal change, or it may fluctuate with weather, whether it's cold, whether it's warm. This is one aspect. The other aspect, toward the end of the year, it's like holiday season, right? So it shouldn't be difficult to expect, or we should expect, the unemployment is going to fall. Why? During the holiday season, so shopping is going to rise, right? Everyone is preparing some gift for their family or for their friends, right? Shopping is right. But then it's after the holiday, and usually, so the retail is going to fall, and then the unemployment is going to fall. That is just two examples. Hence, to really understand the long-term trend, of our macroeconomy, usually we do a seasonal adjustment. So basically, we just get rid of the seasonal effect on the fluctuation of our economy. So that's why we do the seasonal adjustment, right? But however, we need to be very careful. So this seasonally adjusted time series may lead us to overlook to some interesting and sometimes important change in our macroeconomy. Again, use the example of winter versus summer. So with technology change or advancement, it might be the case. So this warm versus cold weather, its impact on unemployment is going to reduce. Why? Because we have better technology, so that even in cold weather, we still can do, like say, for example, farming, right? Using my greenhouse, right? Or in other words, with technology change, this seasonal effect is going to dwindle. Meaning, so if you're comparing winter versus summer, so the change in unemployment may start to decline. But if we only look at seasonally adjusted macro variable, you're going to miss those interesting patterns. What's the interesting patterns? Essentially, the technology change may change the patterns of the seasonal unemployment rate. Right? To summarize, yes, we may want to do seasonal adjustment, right? To see the long-term trend. But on the other hand, we should be careful. Don't miss out some particular patterns is going to change with technology change or maybe policy change. Right? This is regarding to seasonal adjustment. Now let's just summarize what we have discussed so far. Now this table is going to summarize the correlation of coefficient. Oh, by the way, so correlation of coefficient is a measure for their correlation. Right? This coming from your statistics. And then so we use standard deviation to measure the volatility. Everything is with respect to real GDP. Let's start with this column. Consumption, their correlation coefficient, or in other words, this is measuring how correlated is consumption with real GDP. Usually, this number is between -1 and 1. If it's -1, means they are perfectly negative correlated. Meaning if GDP increased by 1%, meaning the consumption is going to decrease by 1%. This is perfectly negative correlated. On the other hand, if it's 1, means they are perfectly positively correlated. If GDP increased by 1%, and then the variable interest will increase by 1%. It's 1 by 1. If it's 0, means they are completely irrelevant. If GDP increases by 1%, you're not going to see any change in the variable interest. Now between -1 and 1. And clearly, so look at here, all these variables are positively correlated, right? This including consumption, investment, employment, and average labor productivity. We have seen those graph before, right? Not only they are positively correlated, and now they are very correlated. It's close to 1, right? And pretty much in the same scale, like close to 0.8. This column. Now let's look at the standard deviation. So standard deviation essentially is just measuring how volatile is your deviation from your trend, right? And here we use the standard deviation of GDP as normalization. So basically, we just use a standard deviation of C divided by standard deviation of Y. By the way, see, this is called sigma. Sigma C is a standard deviation of consumption divided by the standard deviation of Y. And hence, we get a percentage. Now, what do we notice? So consumption is less volatile compared to real GDP because this is 77%, but it's pretty close. Employment, less volatile. Average labor productivity, less volatile, but pretty close. Now, the exception is investment. It's very volatile, 3 times more volatile compared to real GDP. Why? It's because, as I explained to you earlier, right? Just think about housing start. Okay? Think about you want to buy a house, or you want to buy some machines, like a big machine like computer, or you want to expand your business, right? So usually, so these are less essential, right? And then so they can respond more volatile compared when GDP fluctuates. Right? So this is a summary of the business cycle. The other way to look at that is look at cyclicality. Look at lead or lag, and look at variability, variation. Right. So it's essential. This is coming from the correlation of coefficient, and this is coming from the standard deviation. And this lead and the lag, except the housing start, most of them are like a coincidental. Or by the way, so employment is slightly lagging, like behind. Right. Now let's look at it here. So consumption, investment, employment, real wage, average labor productivity, everything are pro-cyclical, meaning they are move in the same direction, meaning they are positively correlated. In terms of their variation or standard deviation, consumption is smaller, employment is smaller, and average labor productivity is smaller. Right? But it's not clear regarding to real wage. Why? This is because real wage, so we don't have a good measure, because you have different people, right? So some may have wage rise in a recession, and some may have wage fall in a recession. It just, you have like a different occupation. Some of the jobs are pro-cyclical, some jobs are counter-cyclical. Right? It's very difficult to measure. So that's why there's a question mark. Now, finally, regarding the lead, so most of them are coincidental, like consumption, investment, and average labor productivity. Employment is slightly behind, right? Because usually, so the economy, this take a while to realize in terms of labor market. There's some, later we are going to call these like stickiness. Right? Regarding the wage, again, it's like question mark, similar to the variation. Is it because so you have different job, different wage? Right. But the other thing is like to look at average, just total number. But the wage is really just hard to have a total number for different jobs, different occupation. Okay. So this is regarding to the business cycle. Right. So summarize, we have examined the data to see the pattern, to see the correlation. And then finally, and worse, we look at the seasonally adjustment. Right. All these patterns is going to be very important to provide a guidance for us to build a theory to understand the fluctuation of our macroeconomy, which is going to pick up toward the end of this